At 7:30 on December 20th, 1943, at Kimballton Airfield in England, Second Lieutenant Charles Charlie Brown strapped into the cockpit of his B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 42 to 3167. The crew called her Ye Olde Pub. Charlie Brown was just 21 years old, a farm boy from West Virginia. This was his very first mission as an aircraft commander, and fate had already decided it would become one of the strangest missions in the history of the Second World War, a mission so sensitive that afterward, the Allied High Command would order it sealed as top secret. The target for today was Bremen, Germany, the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft factory. Bremen wasn't just a red dot on a map, it was a fortress. It was defended by more than 250 heavy 88mm flak guns, and worse than that, it sat right in the backyard of Jagdgeschwader 1, the Luftwaffe's notorious yellow-nose fighter wing. The math was simple and brutal. A single B-17 carrying 10 men and 4 tons of bombs, flying into a net of fire woven by hundreds of cannons and dozens of the world's deadliest interceptors. The survival rate for the 379th Bomb Group the previous month was less than 50%. 4. Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines roared to life, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The entire 30-ton metal beast shook violently on the foggy runway. The sharp smell of aviation fuel mixed with the scent of cold sweat. Ye Olde Pub lifted off the tarmac, climbing to join the combat box formation. American military doctrine believed that when B-17 seconds flew tight together, the firepower from 12 50 caliber Browning machine guns on each ship would create an impenetrable wall of lead. They called it the Flying Fortress. But at 27,000 feet, the outside temperature was 60 degrees below 0 Celsius. If a gun jammed, you had to take off your gloves to fix it, and your skin would freeze instantly to the cold metal. If your oxygen system failed, you were brain dead in 3 minutes. 10 minutes to the drop. Bremen appeared beneath the cloud cover, and then hell opened its doors. Black flowers of death began to bloom around the formation, 88mm flak shells. They didn't need a direct hit. A single shell exploding within 20 meters could shred the thin aluminum skin of a B-17. Boom. Boom. The fortress on Brown's right wing took a direct hit. It snapped in half and dropped like a stone. No parachutes appeared. Charlie Brown gripped the yoke tighter. He knew the real nightmare hadn't even started yet. The flak was just the prelude. The real hunters were still waiting high above. Just as the bomb bay doors opened, a deafening explosion tore through the nose. A piece of flak had slashed open the plexiglass nose cone. Air at 60 below zero rushed into the cockpit like an invisible blade. Engine number 2 began spewing black smoke. Engine number 4 lost its governor, the propeller spinning wildly out of control. Ye Olde Pub was critically wounded. She was losing airspeed. And in the brutal world of aerial combat, the golden rule of survival is, never fall behind. But Charlie Brown had no choice. The giant bomber shuddered and dropped out of the protective formation. She was now alone, bleeding prey, drifting in a sky filled with Luftwaffe sharks. Falling behind is a death sentence. The protective box was gone. The wall of defensive fire was gone. Now, Ye Olde Pub was just a slow-moving target on a firing range. And the Luftwaffe didn't waste a second. They spotted the wounded bird immediately. More than a dozen Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds peeled off from their high-altitude perch to finish the job. They lined up like executioners. The attacks were relentless. They came in waves, specifically targeting the tail, the bomber's blind spot. 20mm cannon shells smashed into the fuselage with the force of sledgehammers. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre. The sound inside the fuselage was deafening, the screech of tearing metal, the explosion of glass, and the chaotic shouting of men over the intercom. In the tail section, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode was the first to fall. A direct hit from a cannon shell decapitated him. The tail gunner position, the only thing guarding their rear, was silenced forever. The cold wind howled through the shattered tail, freezing the blood instantly. Up front, Charlie Brown was fighting a losing wrestling match with the yoke. The hydraulic system was gone. The electrical system was dead. The oxygen system was shot out on the left side. The radio was destroyed. The internal temperature plummeted to Arctic levels. The bomber was being turned into Swiss cheese. Bullets shredded the rudder. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely blown away. The nose cone, already damaged by flak, was now just a jagged hole, exposing the bombardier to the freezing slipstream. Then, engine number 3 took a hit. It sputtered, coughed, and died. They were down to one good engine, one engine to carry 30 tons of dead weight. The aircraft entered a violent spiral dive. Brown pulled back with every ounce of strength he had. His boots braced against the instrument panel, his muscles screaming. The ground was rushing up to meet them. 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. Miraculously, he managed to pull her level, just above the treetops. But the situation was hopeless. They were flying over the heart of Germany, alone, broken, and virtually defenseless. The crew was groggy from hypoxia. The morphine syrettes in the first aid kits were frozen solid. 3 of the crew were critically wounded. They were just waiting for the final blow. And then it appeared. A lone fighter plane spotted the limping bomber. But this wasn't just any pilot. This was an ace. On the ground at Jever Airfield, Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler was standing by his Messerschmitt B-109 Gesäß. He was smoking a cigarette, waiting for his ground crew to finish rearming his aircraft. Stiegler was not a rookie. He was a veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 27. He had flown over North Africa, fought in the skies of the Mediterranean, and now defended the fatherland. He had 27 confirmed kills to his name. He needed just one more victory to earn the Knight's Cross, the highest honor in the German military. One more kill, just one. Through the haze, he saw it. A B-17 Flying Fortress, flying incredibly low, trailing black smoke, and limping directly over his airfield. It was moving so slowly, it looked like it was hanging in the air. Stiegler threw his cigarette into the mud. This was a gift wrapped in aluminum. A fat car, as the German pilots called them. A straggler. An easy kill. The kind of victory pilots dream about. He scrambled into the cockpit. The Daimler-Benz engine roared to life. Within minutes, Stiegler was airborne. His Bf-109, sleek and deadly, clawed for altitude. He closed the distance in seconds. The B-17 was defenseless. It was crawling at less than 150 miles per hour. Stiegler approached from the rear, climbing into the classic attacking position. He checked his gun sights. His thumb hovered over the firing button of his 20mm cannon. He expected the bomber's tail guns to light up. He expected a wall of defensive tracers, but there was nothing. Silence. The tail turret was pointed downward at a useless angle. Stiegler moved in closer. Too close. What he saw through his windscreen made his blood run cold. The tail gunner wasn't firing because he was gone. The entire rear of the fuselage had been blasted away. He could see the jagged ribs of the airframe. He could see the blood frozen on the torn metal skin. He eased off the throttle and pulled up alongside the fuselage, flying formation with the enemy. He was now just 20 feet away, close enough to see the rivets, close enough to see the terrified faces of the crew inside the waist gunner positions. They were wounded, bandaged, huddled together, against the freezing wind rushing through the massive holes in the side of the plane. This wasn't an airplane anymore. It was a flying sieve. It was a graveyard. By all laws of aerodynamics, this wreck should have been a smoking crater in a field miles back. Stiegler looked at the cockpit. He saw the pilot, Charlie Brown, struggling to keep the dying bird in the air. Brown looked out and saw the gray fighter, with the black crosses on its wings, locked in formation right beside him. He froze. He knew he was staring death in the face. Stiegler's finger tightened on the trigger. One burst. Less than a second. That's all it would take to turn Olde Pub into a fireball and secure his Knight's Cross. The math was perfect. The opportunity was perfect. But Franz Stiegler didn't fire. In that split second, a voice echoed in Stiegler's mind. It wasn't the voice of his commanding officer demanding a kill count. It was the voice of his mentor, Gustav Rodel, from years earlier in the scorching deserts of North Africa. Rodel had told him, "Honor is everything here. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." Stiegler looked at the B-17 again. It was helpless. It wasn't a threat. To Stiegler, this shattered metal skeleton wasn't an enemy aircraft anymore. It was a parachute made of aluminum. Shooting it down now wouldn't be a victory. It would be murder. It would be a stain on his soul that no metal could ever cover. He took his finger off the trigger. He pulled his Bf-109 closer, wingtip to wingtip with the bomber. He could see Charlie Brown's eyes wide with terror. Brown was waiting for the muzzle flash. The end. But Stigler didn't attack. Instead, he waved. He gestured frantically with his gloved hand. He pointed down toward the ground. He was trying to tell them to land. "Land! You're dying! Put it down!" Brown didn't understand. He thought the German was mocking him, toying with him before the kill. He shook his head. He kept the nose pointed toward England, even though England felt 1,000,000 miles away. Stigler cursed under his breath. He realized the American pilot was too scared or too stubborn to surrender. He tried a different signal. He pointed east, toward Sweden. Sweden was neutral territory. It was only 30 minutes away. If they flew there, they would be interned for the rest of the war. But they would live. Go to Sweden. Stigler shouted inside his oxygen mask, pointing repeatedly. But Brown just stared blankly, his hands white-knuckled on the controls. He refused to turn. He was going home or he was going to die trying. Stigler checked his fuel gauge. He was burning precious time. But he made a decision that was essentially treason. If he couldn't force them to land, he would guide them through the gauntlet. They were approaching the Atlantic Wall, the coastline heavily defended by German anti-aircraft batteries. If the gunners on the ground saw a lone B-17, they would blow it out of the sky in seconds. But if they saw a Messerschmitt flying in close formation with it, they would hold their fire. They wouldn't risk hitting one of their own. Stigler positioned his fighter precisely off the bomber's left wing, shielding it from the ground gunner's view, effectively becoming a human shield for the enemy. It was the most dangerous bluff of the war. They were now flying over the German coastline, directly above the heavy flak batteries of the Atlantic Wall. On the ground, German gun crews tracked the strange formation through their rangefinders. They saw the battered American bomber, low and slow. It was the perfect target. Fingers hovered over firing buttons. But they also saw the distinctive silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf-109 glued to its wing. The logic of the ground gunners stalled. Why was a German fighter flying so close? Was it a captured plane? Was it a secret test flight? Or had the fighter pilot already claimed the kill and was escorting the wreck down to capture? Confusion bought time. And time was the only thing keeping Charlie Brown alive. Not a single shot was fired from the ground. Stigler's gamble had worked. He had successfully smuggled the enemy through his own defense lines. They reached the open water of the North Sea. The flak towers faded behind them. Stigler checked his fuel gauge again. The needle was bouncing off the empty peg. He had pushed his luck as far as it could go. If he stayed any longer, he wouldn't have enough fuel to make it back to Jever. He would have to ditch in the freezing ocean, and he would die just as surely as the men he was saving. He looked across at Charlie Brown one last time. The American pilot was still white-knuckled, staring back with a mixture of confusion and awe. Stigler didn't use the radio. He didn't wave frantically anymore. He simply brought his gloved hand up to his forehead. A crisp, sharp military salute. It wasn't a salute to an enemy. It was a salute to a fellow warrior who had survived the impossible. Then, Stigler banked his fighter hard to the left. He rolled the wings, once a universal aviation gesture of farewell, and peeled away, diving back toward the German coast. Charlie Brown watched the gray fighter disappear into the mist. For the first time in hours, the sky around Olde Pub was empty. The sudden silence was almost louder than the roar of the battle. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing reality. They were alive, yes, but they were still over the North Sea, hundreds of miles from England, in a plane that was practically scrap metal. The altimeter read 250 feet. They were dangerously low. The only working engine was overheating. The airframe groaned with every gust of wind. And now, a new enemy emerged. Not the Luftwaffe, not the Flak, but the sea itself. The waves below were dark and choppy, waiting to swallow the broken bomber. Brown turned to his co-pilot, Spencer Pinky Luke. They didn't need to speak. They both knew the truth. They didn't have the altitude to bail out. They didn't have the structural integrity to ditch safely. Their only option was to fly until the fuel ran out or the wings fell off. Brown wrestled the controls, fighting to gain even a few inches of altitude. He ordered the crew to throw everything heavy overboard: machine guns, ammunition belts, flak jackets, radios. Everything that wasn't bolted down went out the hatch. They were trading weight for seconds. They were buying life with ounces. And then, through the thick gray fog of the English Channel, a coastline appeared. But was it England? Or had they drifted back over occupied France? The coastline wasn't France. It was Norfolk, England. They had crossed the impossible distance on a wing and a prayer, but ye Olde Pub was now a falling brick. Brown spotted an airfield ahead, RAF seething. He didn't have the altitude to circle. He didn't have the power to go around. He had one shot. He dropped the landing gear. Without hydraulics, he had to rely on gravity and manual cranking. He felt the heavy wheels lock into place with a thud. The runway rushed up to meet them. Brown cut the power to the single screaming engine. The bomber slammed onto the tarmac. It bounced, groaned, and screeched as it tore down the runway. Without brakes, Brown had to let the friction and the grass overrun do the work. When the dust settled, the plane was silent. Brown sat in the cockpit, his body numb, his hands frozen in a claw-like grip on the yoke. He was alive. His crew was alive. Ground crews raced toward the wreck in jeeps and fire trucks. When they reached the plane, they stopped dead in their tracks. They stared in disbelief. They had never seen a B-17 inches this condition remain in one piece. The tail was shredded. The nose was gone. The fuselage was a colander of bullet holes. It was a miracle of engineering and stubborn will. But the real shock came in the debriefing room. A warm cup of brandy was shoved into Brown's hand. An intelligence officer sat across from him, pen hovering over a notepad. "Tell us what happened, Lieutenant," he said. Brown recounted the flak, the fighters, the damage. And then he told them about the lone Bf-109. He described the gray fighter with the yellow nose. He described how it flew formation, how it escorted them over the Atlantic Wall. And finally, he described the salute. The intelligence officer stopped writing. The room went dead silent. He looked at Brown, then stood up and left the room. An hour later, he returned with a high-ranking colonel. The brass didn't congratulate Brown. They didn't talk about medals. The colonel looked Brown in the eye and delivered a crushing order. "Lieutenant, you are to tell no one about this. Not your crew, not your family, not your fellow pilots. This incident is classified top secret. As far as you are concerned, it never happened." Brown was stunned. "But sir, he saved us." "That is exactly why," the colonel replied coldly. "We are in a total war. If word gets out that a German pilot showed mercy, our boys might start thinking the enemy is human. They might hesitate to pull the trigger next time. We cannot have that. You will bury this story, Lieutenant, or you will face court-martial." And just like that, the most incredible moment of humanity Charlie Brown had ever witnessed was erased. He was ordered to forget the man who gave him his life. For decades, the file gathered dust in the Pentagon's archives. Brown went on to survive the war, return to West Virginia, go to college, and start a family. But the ghost of the gray fighter never left him. Who was that pilot? Why did he spare them? The questions haunted him for 40 years. Until 1987, when Charlie Brown, now an old man, decided to break his silence. He started a search for the enemy who had become his savior. For more than 40 years, the image of the gray fighter plane remained burned into Charlie Brown's memory. It was a ghost story that refused to fade. In 1986, retired and living in Miami, Brown finally decided he couldn't live with the mystery any longer. He needed to know who had spared him. He needed to know why. But finding one specific German pilot 4 decades after the war was a task that bordered on delusion. The Luftwaffe had lost the vast majority of its pilots. Records had been burned, lost, or scattered across a divided Germany. Brown began by digging through U.S. Army Air Force archives. He searched combat reports. He attended reunions. He asked fellow veterans. But every lead turned into a dead end. Most people told him he was chasing a phantom. They suggested that perhaps, in the trauma of the battle, he had hallucinated the salute. Brown refused to give up. He knew what he had seen. In a final act of desperation, he wrote a letter to a newsletter titled Jägerblatt the Fighter Pilot. It was a publication for former Luftwaffe pilots. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of time. The ad was simple. It stated he was searching for the German pilot who escorted a damaged B-17 out of German airspace on the 20th of December 1943. Brown didn't expect a reply. He prepared himself for silence. But he didn't know that thousands of miles away, not in Germany, but in Vancouver, Canada, a prosperous businessman was opening his mail. Franz Stigler had survived the war. It was a statistical miracle in itself. He had flown 487 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. He had lost his brother, his leaders, and his country. After the war, with nothing left in Germany, he had immigrated to Canada in 1953, with nothing but a few tools and his skills as a mechanic. He had built a new life, burying his past deep inside. He never spoke about the war. And he certainly never spoke about the B-17 he had let go. To speak of it was to admit to treason. But on that morning in January 1990, Stigler opened his copy of Jägerblatt. His eyes scanned the pages. And then he stopped. His heart began to hammer against his ribs just as hard as it had in the cockpit of his Bf-109 47 years earlier. There, in black and white, was the date, the 20th of December, 1943. The location, the description of the crippled bomber. Stigler sat down, his hands trembling. For nearly half a century he had wondered. He had watched that B-17 disappear into the mist over the North Sea. Trailing smoke, parts falling off, flying so low it was skimming the waves. He had assumed they crashed. He had assumed the sea claimed them. He had lived his entire life thinking that his act of mercy had been in vain. But they had made it. The pilot was alive. The man he had saluted was looking for him. Stigler immediately went to his desk. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote a letter to Charlie Brown, but he didn't just write words. He included details that only the pilot of that fighter could know. He described the damage to the tail. He described the specific way the left elevator was blown off. And then, he wrote the sentence that would bring Charlie Brown to his knees. I was the one. In Miami, Charlie Brown held the letter as if it were a fragile artifact from an ancient civilization. He read the words over and over again. I was the one. The handwriting was elegant, European, but it was the details that made his breath catch in his throat. The writer mentioned the blown-off horizontal stabilizer. He mentioned seeing the crew huddled in the waist section, trying to tend to the wounded. He mentioned the specific hand gesture he used to try and signal them to land. No one could know these things. Not the historians, not the imposters, not the glory seekers. Only the man who was in that cockpit, 20 feet away, looking him in the eye at 300 miles per hour, could know. Charlie picked up the phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number for Vancouver, Canada. It rang 3 times. Then a voice answered. Deep, calm, heavily accented with the unmistakable cadence of a native German speaker. Hello? This is Franz Stigler. Charlie Brown didn't introduce himself. He didn't say hello. He asked the question that had been burning a hole in his soul for 47 years. Why didn't you shoot? There was a pause on the line, a silence that stretched across decades and borders. Then Franz replied softly, Because, my friend, you were defenseless. To me, it would have been like shooting a man in a parachute. I saw your blood. I saw your struggle. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. Tears streamed down the face of the old American bomber pilot. The man on the other end wasn't a monster. He wasn't the faceless enemy propaganda had painted. He was a man of honor. They talked for hours that night. They talked about their squadrons, their losses, their nightmares. They realized that for nearly 50 years, they had been living parallel lives, haunted by the same moment, bound together by a secret act of chivalry amidst a world of slaughter. They knew they had to meet. Not over the phone, not through letters. They had to look each other in the eye again. They arranged a meeting in Seattle, Washington, halfway between their homes. The 21st of June, 1990. The lobby of the hotel was busy with travelers, businessmen, and tourists. But when the elevator doors slid open, time seemed to stop. Charlie Brown stood there, waiting. He saw an elderly man walking towards him. He didn't see the wrinkles or the gray hair. In his mind, he saw the young ace in the leather flight jacket. Franz Stigler saw the man walking towards him. He didn't see a retired grandfather. He saw the terrified kid in the cockpit of a broken B-17. They didn't shake hands. They didn't salute. Without saying a word, the two former enemies threw their arms around each other. They hugged tightly, sobbing uncontrollably in the middle of the hotel lobby. "My brother," Franz whispered, choking back tears. "I have found you." "I never forgot you," Charlie replied. "I never forgot." For the people watching in the lobby, it was just two old men hugging. But for history, it was the closing of a circle. It was proof that even in the darkest chapter of human history, where hate was industrialized and mercy was considered treason, a spark of humanity could still survive. But the story didn't end with a hug. As they sat down to talk, Franz revealed something else. Something that showed just how close Charlie Brown had come to death, not from the Germans, but from the silence itself. And as the media began to pick up the story, the secret that the U.S. government had tried to bury exploded onto the world stage. The secret that the Pentagon had buried for half a century was finally out, and the shockwave was global. The story of the German ace, who spared the American bomber, didn't just make headlines. It shattered the black and white narrative of the Second World War. For decades, the world had been taught that the enemy was faceless, heartless, and evil. But here were two men, standing side by side, proving that even in the inferno of combat, honor could survive. The media called it a higher call. But for Charlie and Franz, the cameras and the interviews were just noise. The real story was what happened after the hotel lobby. They didn't just meet once and go their separate ways. They became inseparable. It was one of the most unlikely friendships in history. Franz Stigler, the man who was trained to kill B-17 seconds, became the closest friend of the man who flew one. They visited each other's homes. They went on fishing trips together in the Canadian wilderness. They sat on porches for hours, not talking about the war, but talking about their grandchildren, their lives, and the peace they had found. Charlie Brown often said, "In all these years, I never had a brother. Franz is the brother I never knew I needed." And for Franz, Charlie was the redemption he had sought his entire life. He had lost his own brother, August, early in the war, a loss that had nearly broken him. In saving Charlie, he felt he had, in a spiritual way, saved his brother. But as their story spread, military historians began to analyze the sheer magnitude of what Franz had done. They realized that this wasn't just a moment of hesitation. It was a calculated act of supreme courage. If a single member of his ground crew had reported the strange flight path, or if a gun camera from another German plane had caught him escorting the enemy, Franz wouldn't have just been court-martialed. He would have been executed by a firing squad for treason. He had bet his life on the humanity of strangers. Letters began to pour in from all over the world. Veterans from both sides, Allied and Axis, wrote to them. Men who had carried the heavy burden of killing. Men who had nightmares about the faces they saw in their gun sights. They wrote to say thank you. Thank you for proving that they weren't just machines. Thank you for showing that a soldier fights for his country, but a warrior fights for his soul. However, time is the one enemy that no pilot can outmaneuver. By the mid-2000s, both men were in their late 80s. Their health was failing, but their bond remained unbreakable. They called each other every week, and in those final years, they made a pact. A promise that only two men who had stared death in the face together could make. They promised that whoever died first, the other would deliver the eulogy. They would not leave each other behind. Just like over the skies of Bremen in 1943, the end was coming. But unlike the violent, freezing death that awaited them over Germany, this time they were surrounded by love, respect, and a peace that they had forged themselves. And when the final moment arrived, it happened in a way that defied coincidence. It was as if the universe itself acknowledged their connection. In the spring of 2008, the final chapter of this incredible saga was written. Franz Stigler, the ace who had risked everything for a stranger, passed away near Vancouver on March 22nd. He was 92 years old. When the news reached Charlie Brown in Miami, he was devastated. He hadn't just lost a friend, he had lost a part of himself. The man who had given him the gift of life was gone. But the story didn't end there. In a twist of fate that seems almost scripted, Charlie Brown's health began to decline rapidly immediately after Franz's death. It was as if the invisible tether that had connected their souls across the Atlantic and then across the decades, was pulling him toward the horizon. On November 24th, 2008, just months after Franz Charlie Brown took his final breath, they had entered the war as enemies, lived their lives as brothers, and left this world in the same year. To those who knew them, it was no coincidence. It was the final formation flight. Today, their story is immortalized in the painting A Higher Call by artist John Weiss. It depicts that frozen moment over the North Sea, the battered B-17 struggling to stay airborne, and the lethal Bf-109 flying protectively at its wingtip. It hangs in military colleges and museums around the world, not as a lesson in tactics, but as a lesson in humanity. History is often written in the blood of the fallen. It is measured in territory gained and cities destroyed. But the legacy of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler teaches us something different. It teaches us that even when the world descends into madness, when governments demand hatred, and when killing becomes a job, the individual human conscience still has the power to say, no. Franz Stigler could have pulled that trigger. He would have won a medal. He would have been celebrated as a hero of the Third Reich. But today, nobody remembers the pilots who racked up the highest kill counts for Nazi Germany. We remember the one who refused to kill. Somewhere in the great beyond, two old pilots are flying wingtip to wingtip again. No flak, no bullets, no enemies. Just clear blue skies and eternal peace. Thank you for watching this incredible story of honor and brotherhood. If this story touched you, please hit that like button. It helps us keep these memories alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a forgotten chapter of history. And tell us in the comments, if you were in Franz Stigler's cockpit that day, with your country demanding a kill, would you have pulled the trigger, or would you have saluted? I'm WW2, and I'll see you in the next briefing.